Good morning. Starting the share in this week's project, Likkutei Sichos, Chelek Yud Zayin, volume 17, the first Sicha on Parshas Tazria, page 125. Afin Pasuk, Uvayoyim Hashmini Yimul B'Sarar Lasoi. The Torah tells us, the beginning of this week's Parsha, that on the 8th day of a baby boy's life, the foreskin should be circumcised. So on this pasuk, on this verse, Darshanin Razalim Teras Kainim, our sages teach us in the Medrash and in Gemara, as well as in the Gemara, that the verse specifically teaches us Bayoim Veloy Balayla. When the Torah tells us that it's Bayoim Hashmini on the 8th day, that implies that it must be done during the day and not at night. According to this, we deduce as der din ein molin balayla, the halacha that a bris may not take place at night is nischadish geworden erst noch matan Torah, was put into place after the Torah was given. Unfar matan Torah, however, before the Torah was given to the Jewish people, hat mila gemekt zayin euch balayla, a bris could have taken place at night as well. Afilu leitem zweiten Makom von dem Din in Masechta Shabbos. So there is another pasuk, another verse in the Torah that is offered as a source for this halacha that a bris must take place during the day and not at night. This pasuk is quoted in another area in the Gemara in Tractate Shabbos. As melerent es up von uben shmoinas yomim. The first time the Torah tells us about bris was when Avram was commanded by Hashem to circumcise himself, and then from that point on, all newborn boys at the age of 8 days old. So the Torah over there says, "Uben shmoinas yomim," when the child is 8 days old, but stated in Parshas Lech Lecha, and that is written in Parshas Lech Lecha in Chumash Bereishis. Befrat, as Tosfos sagt, as der Ikar Limud is von dem pasuk. And the Tosfos, the commentators on the Talmud, state that verse in Parshas Lech Lecha is actually the original and the primary source for this halacha that a bris must take place during the day and not at night. So we have two psukim. We have the verse in our parsha that the Medrash says is the source for the halacha that the bris must take place during the day, and then we have another pasuk in Parshas Lech Lecha, which is quoted in the Masechta Shabbos, and over there they say, the Gemara over there says that is the source for a bris having to take place during the day and not at night. So that verse and the Gemara in Shabbos is only referring to a bris that takes place at the appropriate time. But if we're talking about a postponed bris, if a child for whatever reason doesn't have his bris on time and the bris is now postponed and it occurs at a later time, muzayin biyoim, how do we know that a postponed bris must take place during the day and not at night? Learned men up from them vov ubayoim hashmini. From our pasuk, from the pasuk in our parsha, in Parshas Tazria, when the Torah begins by saying "and" on the 8th day, from that extra letter vav, which means "and," that is how we learn that a postponed bris also must take place during the day. As Tosfos there explains, so the bottom line of this short discussion is that the halacha that a bris must take place, whether it's at the right time on the 8th day or a postponed bris that it must take place during the day rather than at night, this halacha was set into place after the giving of the Torah, after Matan Torah. So to explain this, we will preface with an interesting story, a fascinating story, in fact, that is described in the Medrash. When the Jews were still in Egypt, right before they were about to leave Egypt. Many of them, many Jews, they did not accept upon themselves this mitzvah of circumcision. They were told to circumcise themselves and they didn't do it. So Hashem said, Sheyasu HaPesach. Then Hashem commanded them to do Pesach, to have a korban Pesach, to observe this one day of Pesach before they left Mitzrayim. The Kivin Ja'asa Moshe HaPesach, and then Moshe Rabbeinu made his own korban Pesach. Gazer HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'dala d'ruchos ha'olam. Hashem commanded the four winds, or the winds from all four sides of the universe, to start blowing. And these winds from all four corners of the world picked up the scent or the aroma of Moshe Rabbeinu's Korban Pesach. And that attracted all the Jews to gather, to congregate outside Moshe Rabbeinu's house. And then they all told Moshe Rabbeinu, please, we beg of you, feed us your Korban Pesach. Let us eat your Korban Pesach. The aroma, the smell was so strong that it attracted them from everywhere. And then he replied to them, if you are not circumcised, you will not be able to eat this Korban Pesach. They immediately circumcised themselves just so that they should be able to eat Moshe Rabbeinu's Korban Pesach. So, fascinating medrash. God orchestrated almost a scheme to get everybody to have the bris before they left Mitzrayim by attracting them to Moshe Rabbeinu's house and having them smell the Korban Pesach. Von dem medrash kommt aus. Now, in this medrash, the point over here seems to be as Eden haben sich mal gewen beleil Pesach. Their bris, the circumcision on that first night of Pesach, took place at night because they smelled Moshe Rabbeinu's Korban Pesach, and that occurred at night during Moshe's Seder. Nachmer, additionally, from the Medrash, befrat Shir Hashirim Rabbi, and in other areas in the Medrash, is mashma as Moshe Rabbeinu hat bechlal nit übergeben zu Eden dem Tzivui b'chol orel yechel boy. Moshe Rabbeinu, in fact, did not convey this commandment that you have to be circumcised in order to eat the Korban Pesach, bis by Nacht, until that very night, when the Eden sind gekommen betten by Moshe nach Leinu mit Pischacha, when the Jews congregated outside in front of his home and asked to eat and requested that they be allowed to eat from his Korban Pesach. So the Jews didn't even know, apparently, according to this medrash, that they had to be circumcised. He's need to move on. So here's something that needs to be clarified. So true that because it was not, the Torah had not yet been given, and the halacha that the bris must take place during the day was not yet in effect. But what does need to be explained, at least according to the deeper understanding or according to Kabbalah and Chassidus, since many of the Jews many of the Jews circumcised themselves at that very moment, and they didn't do it on their own accord, nor the reason they circumcised themselves at that moment was because Hashem had orchestrated the winds to attract them to Moshe Rabbeinu's home. So it's not something that they did on their own accord. They didn't choose to have a bris. They were so tempted and they had such a strong desire for Moshe Rabbeinu's Korban Pesach that they were almost forced to. When the smell of this aroma forced them to want to eat Moshe Rabbeinu's Korban Pesach. Hashem could have orchestrated the exact same event or something similar before night, before it got dark. And at that point, Moshe would have been able to tell them this commandment that anyone uncircumcised cannot partake in the Korban Pesach earlier. When they would have had their bris during the day, which is more appropriate and more in tune with the final halacha. So why did this wind and the aroma that attracted the Jews to Moshe Rabbeinu's home occur at night rather than during the day? The Likkutei, a commentary on the Medrash will sagen, attempts to answer. It's possible that this actually occurred before it got dark. Bring the roof and he offers two proofs, which the Rebbe will soon reject. Because once it became dark, it was Yontif, and as we know, a postponed bris may not occur on Shabbos and Yontif. It has to occur on a weekday. If it's on the 8th day, so then the bris always takes precedence and it happens on Shabbos and Yontif. But if it's a postponed bris, then it cannot take place on Shabbos and Yontif. And once the sun set, once it was dark, they couldn't do a bris on Yontif. So that's the Likkutei's first proof that it happened before it got dark. The oid, and another proof is the ein mila balayla, a general statement that a bris cannot take place at night. Shabbos, Yantif, weekday, whenever bris doesn't take place at night. So, as we said, the Rebbe rejects these two answers. We can't say this. But from the Sipur, we have gebracht in Shir HaShirim Rabbah. The way the story is described in Shir HaShirim Rabbah in the Medrash, after Pasuk Acha HaMelech b'Mesibui, which is describing, which is a commentary on the verse, until the king is sitting at his table, is klar as is given balayla. It's very obvious that it occurred at night. The king, Moshe Rabbeinu, is sitting at his table. When do you sit at your Seder table, at your Pesach table? It's already nighttime. So it's not something that occurred earlier in the day before Moshe was sitting at his Seder table. Dort steht beferish, in that pasuk, or the Medrash on that pasuk, it says very clearly, when the king was sitting at his table, it occurred when Moshe and the Jewish people were sitting at their Seder table and eating their Korban Pesach in Egypt. Unachilas Pesach, specifically, the consumption of the Korban Pesach must occur. It has to happen at night. Beleil Tezvav Nisan, the night of the 15th of Nisan, the Seder doesn't occur before dark, and all the mitzvahs associated with the Seder must take place at night, especially eating the Korban Pesach. Und die zwei Hechrechim, bring these two proofs that the Yifei Toyar offers. Aleph, Milosh Levisman is Nitei Yamtif, that a postponed bris does not override Yamtif. And Beis, Ein Mila Balayla, that a bris cannot take place at night, are not compelling enough. Why? Weil Allah, first of all, as we said earlier, is the din as Ein Mila Balayla, the halacha, that a bris cannot take place at night by Shaloi Bismana, specifically regarding a postponed bris, erst nicht chadish geworden, noch Matan Torah. That halacha was put into effect only after the Torah was given, and this is prior to Matan Torah. The Torah had not yet been given; they were still in Egypt, and therefore the halacha that a bris cannot take place at night was not in effect here. And Beis, his other answer, his first answer, really, similarly, by Pesach Mitzrayim. Pesach, when the Jews observed it for the first time in Egypt, there was no commandment forbidding malacha, forbidding work. And any of the lamates malachas, or those particular labors and works that are not allowed on Yantif, it was not yet in effect while they were still in Mitzrayim. Now the Rebbe is going to explain why. So there's a pasuk right in the beginning of the laws of Korban Pesach and the laws of Pesach and state in Parshas Bo. In Parshas Bo, it says that on the first day and on the seventh day of Pesach, those are holy days, and therefore no work may be done on them. So it seems that it does apply perhaps to that first Pesach that they were in Egypt. However, we must say, as the pasuk that verse is not talking about that first Pesach that they observed in Egypt. But in Pesach Mitzrayim, that Pesach that they observed for the first time in Mitzrayim was only observed for one day. And the verse is referring to a time when you have a full 7-day holiday. The Pesach is observed for the full 7 days. So we must say that it's not referring to that year when there was only a 1-day Pesach. Right? We also cannot say that the verse is referring to two separate scenarios that are independent of each other. The first one, Aleph of Yom Rishon Mikra Kodesh, was given that the first day, which is a Yantiv, was observed only in Mitzrayim, and Beis of Yom Rishon Mikra Kodesh was a Shayach Ner Pesach Deiros, and the seventh day is an observance that's only relevant in the future. You can't say that this verse is talking about two separate scenarios. It has to be the same thing. Why? First of all, in Pasuk Shteit Kol Malach Lo Ya'aseh Behem, the Torah tells us very clearly in this verse that no work may be done in them, plural, Behem. That says that there is Melacha from Yom Rishon and from Yom Hashvi, the prohibition of doing work on the first day of Pesach and on the seventh day of Pesach, wherein beide Nichlal and Zelben Tzivui are included in the same commandment. So when the Torah says you shall not do work on the first day, and you shall not do work on the seventh day, it means that in a scenario where you have both a first day and a seventh day, that's when work is forbidden. But over here in Mitzrayim, because there was no seventh day, therefore the prohibition of work on the first day was also not in effect. Days. Another reason this doesn't work, on the verse, no work shall be done in them, steht in Mechilte, the Medrash Mechilte states, from that verse, when it says that no work may be done in them, we only understand, or at least on the surface, we only understand that it applies to the seventh day. Yom Tov Rishon Minayin. How do we know that no work may be done on the first day of Yom Tov as well? When the verse refers to the first day of Pesach as a holy day, that teaches us that work may also not be done on that first day of Pesach. What this Mechilte is telling us then, as that Iker Isur, the primary prohibition, state of B'yom HaShvi, was said in the Torah regarding the seventh day. And from that we can apply the same halacha, the same rule that no work may be done, also to the first day. But the primary rule of no work being done on Pesach was said with regards to the seventh day. B'Baal, Pesach Mitzrayim is given their Ikara Isur, is not given their Ikara Isur B'yom HaShvi, and since while they were in Egypt, there was no seventh day, and therefore the primary source of this prohibition of doing work on Pesach did not exist. Therefore, the additional prohibition of B'yom HaRishon, of not doing work on the first day, Pesach Mitzrayim, cannot be including this Pesach that they observed in Mitzrayim. And Gimel, on a third problem with this explanation, by Pesach Mitzrayim is Bechlal given B'yom HaRishon. Pesach that was observed in Egypt was not the first day. It was a one day, nor Yom Echad. You only refer to something as the first when there's a second, third, and so on. But the Pesach that they observed in Mitzrayim was a one-day affair, and the Torah would not have been referring to it as Yom Rishon, as the first day. Therefore, with these three rejections in mind, we know that there is no way there would have been a prohibition to do a bris on Yom Tov then, because the Isser, the prohibition of doing malach, of doing work, only started the next year, the next Pesach. Now, there is an opinion of the Ran, a commentator on the Talmud, who says, as the Pesach Mitzrayim is yegiven on Isser Melacha, whatever his reasoning is, but he says that there actually was a prohibition to do work like it is today on Yom Tov, on that one day that they observed Pesach in Egypt. Coming for entering the Kasha from Medrash, we can still answer this question that we have on the Medrash. How could a postponed bris override Yom Tov? When we analyze the words of the other Medrash in Ashir Ashirim. So the Medrash says that the bris occurred at night. According to the Ran, you still cannot do a bris on Yom Tov, even that one Yom Tov that they observed in Mitzrayim. But by analyzing the wording of the Medrash and Shir Shirim Rabbah, we'll understand this as well. Medrash quotes a verse, quotes a pasuk. They were all very well versed in military tactics, holding onto swords. Everybody's sword was resting on his hip. When Moshe Rabbeinu told them, when he instructed them to have a bris, and he told them that the only way that they would be able to consume and to partake in his Karban Pesach was if they were circumcised. Miyad kol echad ve'echad not al charba. Immediately, everybody drew his sword al yerechei from his hip, umal atzmai, and circumcised himself. So this medrash becomes more and more fascinating. What happened that last night in Egypt suddenly is put into a whole new perspective. First of all, they didn't know that they had to have a bris. They come to Moshe Rabbeinu and they're told, you want to partake in my Karban Pesach, you need to be circumcised. They drew their swords and immediately on the spot, circumcised themselves. So the Medrash says that's what happened. The Lechura, let's try to analyze the wording over here. Let's see what this means. Why does it matter that they circumcise themselves with a sword? Their ikir is doch, as they haben sich mal gewen miyad. What really matters is that they circumcise themselves immediately on the spot. What relevance is the tool that they used? Beis, Another thing that we need to analyze over here is why does the Medrash emphasize, or what does the Pasuk emphasize, and the Medrash deduce from that it was that individual's personal sword, Zayin Cherev, his sword. Why do we care if it belonged to this person or to another person? If he circumcised himself with his own sword or with someone else's? This answers the question that we just had on the Medrash. When do we say that circumcision is forbidden on Yom Tov? When it's done in its regular, normal fashion. Be'izmil, using a special knife called an izmil that the moil uses to perform a bris. A small knife. Aber mila becherev, circumcising with a sword, is a malacha shaloi kedarka, is completely out of the ordinary. When azam malacha is muter midiraisa. According to the strict biblical interpretation of the law, you are allowed to circumcise yourself with a sword because it's not your typical way of doing it. The Rabbi is their medrash. When the pasuk was breaking, therefore the medrash, quoting this pasuk in Madgish, it highlights as that this circumcision that occurred that first Pesach in Egypt was done with a sword. Then as but if the pasuk and the medrash would have only highlighted the fact that it was a sword, but not that individual's personal sword, we could have still assumed as it could have been referring to a sword that is used for bris, for circumcision, via state, with regards to the circumcision that Yehoshua, Joshua, Moshe's successor, did later, many years later. The pasuk actually says, you shall create yourself a sword, you should form a sword, and again, circumcise the Jewish people. Over there, the pasuk uses the word sword or cherev to refer to the tool used for a bris. The Rabbi is the pasuk matkish charbe. That's why the pasuk over here emphasizes that it was every person's personal sword. Zayin cherev, his own sword. The cherev from mulum de milchama, swords that are associated with people that go to war, that go to battle. A real sword, not a euphemistic sword, which is a small knife used for a bris, but an actual sword and that kind of sword is not typically used for circumcision. Malpiza, based on this, as Pesach Mitzrayim that the first Pesach, that night, everybody circumcised themselves at night. All this brings us back to our original question that we started off the Sicha. Once God was orchestrating these events to have everybody circumcise themselves before they ate Moshe Rabbeinu's Karban Pesach, why didn't Hashem just arrange for it to happen while it was still daytime? So there's another answer that later commentators offer, and this will help us understand everything that led up until here. The question again was, how did the Jews circumcise themselves at night? So the commentators and the Talmud say, as the Nacht von Yetzias Mitzrayim, that evening, prior to their exodus from leaving Egypt, is given, as the Zohar says, in an oifen von Belayla kiyom yoyer. That night shone like daytime. It was lit up. It was bright like the day. So that night, that one night, was considered to be day. Although it was actually on the clock, it was nighttime, but it was so bright out that it felt like daytime. So they were able to do a bris then. Of them. For just the Yidden. For just the Yidden, they had light. Frekman of them, but the question that can still be asked: if halachically that evening was considered day, how are the Yidden, how are the Jews able to perform all the other mitzvahs of that evening that require it to be night? The Torah says that on the night of the 15th of Nisan, Achilas Pesach, you have to eat the Karban Pesach, you have to eat matzah, marar, v'chulu, and all the other things associated with it being specifically nighttime. So which is it? Was it day, and therefore they were halachically able to circumcise themselves, or was it night, and therefore they were able to fulfill the mitzvahs of Pesach? Muzman sagen. Therefore, we must conclude, as der din von Yom beleil Yetzias Mitzrayim, when we consider the night of Pesach, when they left Egypt, to have been like day, is given nor lagabe mitzvahs milah, that was only regarding the mitzvah of bris, of circumcision. Aber nit lagabe the mitzvahs anal, but not regarding the other mitzvahs. Und der Chiluk is verstandig bepashtus. The difference is obvious. Obviously, only once the Rebbe makes it obvious for us. As is given a tzivim mefurish of them, because the Torah commanded them very clearly. You shall eat the meat of the Korban Pesach on this night, with your belts girded, fastened, and ready to leave. The Torah says that night was actually night, but only in the context of the mitzvahs of Pesach. In the context of bris, it was daytime. Very simple difference according to the Rebbe's interpretation. Bris has to happen during the day, so it was day, and Pesach has to happen at night, so it was night. Very simple answer once we have all the cards in place. Now we'll try to understand this a little bit more according to Chassidus and Kabbalah. Mit was is the mitzvah's milah anders? How is the mitzvah of bris, of circumcision, different? Was nor lagabi ir is the nacht given b'chinas v'layla kayom yoyer. Why is bris different? That specifically for its purpose, the night shone like the day. Der Inyan von Yetzias Mitzrayim is given in ganzen bederech von Pesach. When the Jews left Egypt, it was in a state of Pesach. What does Pesach mean? Dilug, skipping over, passing over. Hecher from Medida v'Hagbala from Teva, rising above the limitations and the constraints of nature. Naturally, the Jews would never have been able to leave Egypt. And we say naturally, there's the nature, there's a spiritual nature, and there's the physical nature. So according to the physical nature, the Jews would not have been able to leave Egypt because, as the Medrash says, no slave had ever escaped from Egypt. So physically, it was impossible for them to leave Egypt. And spiritually as well. The Jews were sunken so deep into the 49th depth of impurity that spiritually they also should not have been able to leave Egypt. And Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus, raised them above both of these limitations, both of these constraints. How do we disrupt the limitations and the constraints of nature here in this world? That is accomplished through disrupting the limitations and constraints. Again, Mitzrayim, the word for Egypt, Mitzrayim, can also mean gvulim, limitations, Meitzarim. By disrupting the limitations from ganz Seder Hishtalshalos. The entire spiritual order of creation must be disrupted in order for the Jews to be able to leave Egypt. How do we disrupt the entire spiritual order of creation? Through there being a light that is greater and beyond any of these limitations. From Kol Seder Shtalshalos, this light has to be greater than everything, even the highest spiritual order. Now, in order for all this to become a reality, it has to be accomplished through Torah. So we have to first find where this concept exists in Torah. This concept of drawing down this light that is greater than the spiritual order, in order to disrupt the limitations of this spiritual order. This must first exist in Torah. In Torah, so we need to draw down a light into Torah from a source that is greater than Torah itself, so to speak. Torah itself also has limitations. Torah has restrictions and Torah has constraints. In order for Torah to be able to rise higher, so to speak, we have to draw down a light into Torah that is higher than Torah. So there's actually three stages here. First, there has to be a light higher than Torah drawn into Torah. That allows us to then draw down a light higher than Seder Ishtalshalos, higher than the spiritual order of creation, into the spiritual order of creation. So we disrupt Torah, we disrupt Seder Ishtalshalos, and the third stage now is drawing this same light into the world itself and disrupting the natural boundaries and the natural limitations of the world. And that's what enabled the Jews to finally leave Egypt. The Rebbe hat der Rebbe gemacht als Moshe Rabbeinu soll übergeben dem Zivui von Michal Ora lo yechel bei nit kodim chashecha nor dafka balayla. And that's why Hashem orchestrated that this commandment that anybody uncircumcised may not partake in the Korban Pesach was given to the Jews not while it was still light, but after dark. To effect that the circumcision that the Jews did to themselves occurs at night, specifically at night. Not the way the halacha is after the Torah was given, the Torah within the constraints and limitations of Torah. Again, once the Torah was given, a bris must take place during the day, cannot take place at night. But that's part of Torah's limitations. Torah says do it here and don't do it there. The light that was revealed and shown on that evening is given ba'ofen was his hecher from gan seder hishtalshalos was such a great light that it was beyond, it was higher, it was greater than the entire spiritual order of creation, all of seder hishtalshalos, biz reaching even hecher from the medida from Torah kvayachol, greater than the limitations of Torah, so to speak. And as a result, the limitations of Seder Ishtalshalos were also disrupted. The light that was drawn down into the world at that moment was like skipping over, passing over, Pesach. This light was drawn into the land of Egypt, which, as we know, was replete and full of idolatry. Based on the natural spiritual order, there should be no divine revelation in Egypt. Nevertheless, on that night, this great light was drawn into Egypt, into the most deprived spiritual place in the world. And as a result, the limitations of the physical world were also disrupted. And that's how they were able to celebrate Pesach, Passover, Dilug, skipping and passing over. And the final result was that they were able to leave Egypt, which was an extremely unnatural occurrence. Now, just like in order for the Jews to be able to leave Egypt, there had to be a skipping over, a passing over within Torah itself. The Jews themselves also had to affect something that would be considered skipping over or passing over and going beyond their own natural order. Therefore, is the Achanaf to Yetzias Mitzrayim given Dam Pesach and Dam Milah. As a preparation for leaving Egypt, there had to be the blood of the Korban Pesach and also the blood of circumcision. Now, these two mitzvahs, from Pesach and Milah, they represent a spiritual divine service that is beyond any limitation and constraint. How so? So first of all, Pesach, as we know, the name of the holiday and the name of the Korban Pesach is Meloshen Dilug. Dilug means skipping over, passing over. So just by the name of this event, of this holiday itself, we know that it has to be associated with rising beyond and disrupting all natural boundaries. On Milah, circumcision, a bris is referred to as in Yona bris olam. It's an eternal covenant with Hashem. An ebeker verbund, an eternal covenant, on kein shum hagbalas, without any limitations. When we say that something is eternal, we say that something is forever, it means it has no end. It means this covenant that is affected through circumcision is also beyond any limitations. So both Pesach and Bris are all about rising beyond limitations and shattering, disrupting the natural order of everything. Damit wir verstehen, was wir gefunden nach Chiddush bei Pesach und Milah, was is nitah bakein ander mitzvahs aseh. One other detail that is found in these two mitzvahs of Karban Pesach and Bris. Now these are positive mitzvahs. These are mitzvahs aseh. They're not negative mitzvahs. They're not don'ts. They're do's. The Torah says you should do the Karban Pesach and you should have a Bris. An anomaly with these two mitzvahs aseh is that the Torah actually describes a consequence for not observing these two mitzvahs aseh. Normally consequences are reserved for mitzvahs leis aseh, but over here these two mitzvahs aseh, not observing them comes along with an extreme consequence. By is achiyuv karas. There's karas, the most extreme type of punishment where your soul is cut off from God, chas v'shalom, by not observing these two mitzvahs. When we're talking about mitzvahs and scenarios that are beyond the natural order, there's no in between. It's all or nothing. Either you observe it or you don't. One of these two. Either you are now connected to Hashem with this eternal covenant, which is greater than any time limitations, it's infinite. Either you have that, and if you do not have this eternal connection to Hashem, then your soul can be cut off, God forbid. You have zero connection to Hashem. Two extremes. Either you're completely connected to Hashem eternally, or you are completely disconnected also eternally. It's a unique thing that only exists by Karban Pesach and by Bris. Similar to what we just said with regards to the general exodus from Egypt. As all limitations must be removed, including the limitations that Torah generally imposes on us. Because if not, we would have remained stuck in Mitzrayim, Eretz Malay Gilulim, this land that is filled with idolatry. So the only way to leave Egypt was to go to the extreme opposite end. Therefore, the revelation that expressed itself through the night shining like the daytime, there had to be a fundamental connection between this light and the mitzvah of circumcision of bris. This, when the night shines like the day, it's a result of this extreme light shining down from above. This revelation that comes from above depends on man himself turning his own night into day. And that's accomplished through bris, through circumcision. So in order for there to have been Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Jews had to have been dragged out and had this eternal covenant connection with Hashem. Without that, there's no way they would have been able to leave Mitzrayim. They would have been able to leave the limitations of Egypt at that time, physically and spiritually. How did they accomplish that? By them taking the initiative and circumcising themselves, which again is an expression of an extreme light, a light drawn down from the highest levels beyond any natural order of spirituality. Based on all of the above, as we said at the beginning of the Sichos, there is a difference between the way bris is performed before Matan Torah, before the Torah was given, and after Matan Torah. Before Matan Torah, a bris was allowed to take place at night, and after Matan Torah, it is limited to only daytime. Der emeser inyan von dilug in mitzvahs milah is dafkin the mitzvahs milah von far Matan Torah. True passing over, true skipping over all the limitations existed really only when they performed a bris before the giving of the Torah. The skipping over, the passing over that was accomplished through being circumcised before the Torah was given was much greater than even going from one extreme to another. It removed, it extracted the Jewish people from the domain of impurity. Und sie machres gewen l'reshus hakadusha, and brought them over to the other end into the domain of holiness. Und in dem Gufa von dem Memshare Tuma, it extracted them from the lowest level, from the 49th lowest, or the 49th depth of impurity. Zum Nigla Aleim HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'choydei v'atzmei, and the result was that Hashem revealed Himself not just the lower levels of godliness, but the highest levels of Hashem b'choydei v'atzmei, His own, the most extreme revelation of godliness. There is no correlation to this revelation anywhere, not even on the flip side. Normally we say that everything that exists in holiness exists also in impurity, but in this case they were extracted from the lowest depths of impurity, but the revelation was without any correlation, without any match. And therefore, once they were brought over into that domain of Hashem's holiness, there were no limitations. And as a result, day and night are meaningless. Day, night, whatever, it doesn't matter. How is that accomplished? Of course, it had to be specifically at night to make the point. But once it occurred, once it did take place that night, we're told it doesn't matter if it's day or night, because our relationship with Hashem transcends time and it transcends all limitations. But then the Torah was given to the Jewish people. Now they started following a specific order. Torah instructs us how to behave. It's holiness. It's Torah. But it's limited. And now this eternal covenant that happened at one time when they left Egypt, it was now also included within the limitations of holiness, of Torah. So now this mitzvah also now becomes limited. And now there's a difference between day and night. And once the Torah was given, a bris may only take place at night. Only during the day and not at night. There has to be a practical lesson, because up until now we're talking about the greatness of the bris that took place before Matan Torah, but we find ourselves now after Matan Torah. So how is all this relevant to us today? As we know, we say in the Haggadah, and the Alter Rebbe elaborates on it in Tanya, that every single day and in every single generation, a person must view himself as if he's leaving Egypt and needs to actually leave Egypt. Every level, any level that you find yourself on, can be considered like Egypt. It can be limiting, it can be constraining. If it's compared to a higher level. So as high as you may have reached today, compared to where you can reach tomorrow, today is a limit. Today is very finite. Today compared to yesterday is infinite. But tomorrow compared to today is even more infinite, if we can use that language. Is b'shas medav harayis from Mitzrayim. So when a Jew needs to leave Egypt, now that we've established that leaving Egypt has to happen every single day, darf man wissen, as es ein nitfaran, dabei kein schon medidus vagbalos. There are no limitations. Even the limitations of Torah are now disrupted, even though Torah was already given. But in order to reach this next level of holiness within our own personal spiritual service of Hashem, we need to disrupt all of these levels. As the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, when a person, God forbid, is at a point where he may transgress one of the Torah's commandments, God forbid, which is a representation of the Egyptian exile in our own life. So God forbid, if a person is at a point where he is about to violate one of Hashem's commandments, there is no difference between a simple mitzvah and an extreme or a complicated, harsher mitzvah. Every single mitzvah, every single commandment in the Torah is equal when you're at the point of violation, God forbid. Because from the perspective of God's will, God's will is not limited to reason and understanding. Even supernal reason and understanding, God's will is greater than that. And all mitzvahs, from that perspective, all mitzvahs are equal. Doesn't matter if it's a simple mitzvah or a harsh mitzvah. By the Kal Shebakalim, And Alter Rebbe continues in Tanya. This leads to even the most unobservant, the lowest of the low. Ruf Tarais means it calls out from within him. It digs deep into his soul and it extracts as that he too can bring himself to a point of self-sacrifice. I feel if I dictu cultural divrei for even the smallest detail of a rabbinic law, without any calculations, without thinking too much into it. There comes a point where a Jew who could be a sinner, God forbid, doesn't live an observant life, doesn't live a very religious life, but suddenly out of the blue, there is that one thing that can call him out. Like the Jews in Egypt who were completely sunken into the 49th depth of impurity, and suddenly, just like that, they were able to extract themselves. How did they extract themselves? As we'll conclude here now. Because there are no limitations of day and night. If there's no difference between different levels of mitzvahs, then there's certainly no difference between day and night. This person, once he decides that he's going all out and is going to sacrifice his own life for the smallest detail, then of course it doesn't matter if he is experiencing light or darkness. Metaphorically, light represents holiness and darkness represents unholiness. It doesn't matter if you're in a state of holiness or unholiness. If you commit, you can do it. It doesn't matter if you're tired, or even worse, you have desires or lusts. With strength, with commitment, with discipline, even that is greater than any logic and reason. You draw your sword and you circumcise yourself right there on the spot. And you connect yourself with Hashem through fulfilling God's will. A fundamental connection to Hashem, and an eternal covenant with God. And everybody can do that.
They were still addicts. They still did ego later. They weren't just waiting till they became, proper.
Right, that's the point. They were
right then.